Please tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and the work that you do.
So my name is Ofentse Lekwane. I'm born and bred in South Africa. I'm 33 years old. Um, what do I do for a living? I currently work in an organization that primarily focuses on resolving youth unemployment. I previously worked in education, but I've also worked in consulting. So I spend a big chunk of my career working within the consulting industry, and then I moved out of that into education and then now into youth unemployment. I've always thought that one of the things I was set out to do in the world, or at least part of my purpose, is to sort of enable access to people that are from previously disadvantaged contexts. So, I mean, I grew up in the rural part of South Africa. I then moved into the township areas in South Africa. I've then lived in an urban area in South Africa, and now I sort of live in Johannesburg, which is the financial capital of the country. And so I've sort of got a very broad experience in terms of my own lived experience and background, but also interacting with people from very different socioeconomic backgrounds. And one of the things that I've always wanted to do is sort of level that playing field from a socioeconomic point of view. And my dream has always been to work in education and in youth unemployment because, in my mind, those are two things that could at least get that playing field leveled out. And so I want to give access. And when I say I want to give access, I'm going to be overt enough to say I actually just want to give better access to Black young people who I've lived in communities with and who I've seen sort of being pushed back and not being able to be economic and agent in society as a function of one, their race, but also their socioeconomic status. And so that's my motivation and how I ended up working in the space that I work in now.
Have you ever faced discrimination or disadvantage on the grounds of race or disability? And how have you overcome that?
I'm a 33-year-old Black female in a country that's got a long history of oppression. I almost look like a great exception to very hard rules that have come along the line. And then when you add the fact that I happen to also be living with a disability, I sort of then stick out as this 1% that sort of survived sort of a lot of madness to get to the place that I am at. And societally, I think we are aware of the challenges that we have. I mean, and we present them in different ways. I think a big bulk of the South African society right now is economically very oppressed and very frustrated. Some of this has resulted in protests and things like that. But I think another big part of the country is very agent in trying to make sure that they redress all these issues. And so they're fighting to start businesses even in the mix of all of this. So have I experienced racism in my country? Yes. And that's because South Africa still has these racial polarities where, I mean, on the day that you decide that a country can now live like a singular, non-segregated country, and you allow everybody to vote and you allow everybody to get jobs and you allow everybody to go to school, what you're not necessarily doing at the same time is changing people's mindsets, right? So as much as South Africa has changed and we've now got access to opportunities equally for everybody, people's mentalities are still that some races are a bit better than others. I think the reality is where we are now in South Africa is that we've just got different forms of racism, right? Where before they would segregate you and lock the door and not allow Black people in, now they are doing it systematically through other things, right? Whether it's when they're filtering through your CV and if your name is unpronounceable, then they don't put it up for the job, right? So what we've just done is sort of changed how racially segregated we are, not the what. The racism still persists. Disability discrimination, have I experienced that? Wholly yes as well, and unfortunately so. And I think when it comes to that particular one, I mean, it's a function of the thing that I've been saying all the time. We don't know enough about disabilities within South Africa to be able to have plain blank conversations that say people with disabilities are just as much human and as much people as the rest of society. And so there's no reason why they should be hidden behind people's houses. There's no reason why they shouldn't have access to the amenities that other people have. Those conversations are not being had. And so all of that ends up leading to disability discrimination, right? In terms of the attitudes towards that and how this has changed over recent years, I'm going to wholly personalize this one. And I say that because I realize that my story when it comes to my like lived experience of disability is very different from other people. And the reason I say that is because when I think about the typical South African living with albinism in South Africa, nobody knows those people. So what happens with albinism is that it generally prevalently happens in Black communities within South Africa. When disabilities happen within rural and Black township communities in South Africa, the narrative around them is generally very negative. And so what ends up happening is that parents and society ostracize and hide those people behind closed doors and don't let them out, because you don't want to come from the family. There's a stigma around coming from a family that's got people that live with disabilities, right? People think households are cursed. I mean, I grew up being told that because I got a different pigmentation type, that my house is cursed and my family is cursed. And at home, there's 3 of us living with disabilities. So arguably, there's triple the curse within my household, right? And so the choice for my mother to actually hide us was a lot easier than the choice for my mother and my father to put us out into the universe. And my parents put us out into the universe. And so a lot of the bullying and all of that actually happened directly, whereas somebody who would have been hidden at home wouldn't have had to experience that. But what it also then meant was that some level of acceptance and semblance of normalcy then started existing for me. So then if you give people in a school 2 to 3 years to sit with a person living with albinism, it's hard for them to still think that this person is cursed when every day they see them in class and passing. And I mean, if you just think about some of the other work that I do outside of my 9 to 5 work, I happen to model and for skin brands and things like that. And part of the reason I actually do that work is because my skin tone is different. And so I've now gone from being this person that would typically not be wanted in a room to the person that an international global product says, I want you to endorse my product. And so somewhere between those 2 things, I've had to then find meaning and what it means to then be living with my disability, right? I do think in some contexts, it's a very powerful positive agent.
If you could go back in time and give one piece of advice to your teenage self, something we can share with current students in Round Square schools, what would it be?
So I'd give myself 2 pieces of advice if I had to take myself back to my teenage self. And the first piece of advice I'd give myself is don't be so afraid. I generally consider myself a fearful person, and I say that because I'm a very curious person, but a lot of my curiosity was stifled by the fact that I was always afraid to explore what that curiosity meant. Whether it was I was curious to say something, but I was too afraid to say it. I was curious to explore something, but I was too afraid to go and do it. I was curious about how certain things worked, but I was scared that if I tried it, I would fail, and so I'd get chastised. So a lot of my younger self made decisions from a very fear-based place, and my mantra right now is do it afraid, for that very reason, is that I don't necessarily think courage is a function of lack of fear. I think courage is being able to jump over that fear hurdle. And so I'd tell myself to not be so afraid if I was younger, because I think I would have then been a lot more authentic to myself. Because the reality is, if I had entertained some of my curiosities, maybe I'd be a completely different person and a more interesting person. Who knows, right? And I'd also say to myself, try out more things, because again, I'm a very curious person. So some of the things I've explored up to my age of 33 are actually not the some of the things I've had an interest in. And so I've sold myself short. I know that. And so I wish I had known this earlier, and I would have just said to myself, Ofentse, go out and try it. If you make a mistake, you will still be loved. If you do it wrong, you will still be loved. If it rejects you, you will still fall back on love. And so don't be so afraid. That's what I would say to myself.